Good morning. How's everybody doing? All right. Well, hey, it is an honor to be here today on behalf of Koch Industries and Charles Koch in particular. Really humbled by the opportunity to be here to speak to you all about this very important issue, how we can improve our criminal justice system. And I want to thank the steering committee members for all their hard work to make this event come together. And I want to thank you to John Jay for hosting, and a special thanks to my friend Carol Mason, not only for this event, but for her lifelong passion for helping people improve their lives by removing the barriers to opportunity that are created by our criminal justice system. And we know this institution is in very good hands, so thank you. Well, I'm going to start by quoting Brian Stevenson. You can never go wrong that way, right? He talks about being proximate to an issue. When you're proximate to the issue, you're proximate to the problem, and you're proximate and close to the remedy. And so I was proximate to the imperfections in our criminal justice system from a young age, when I was a jail guard in my hometown of Worcester, Massachusetts. That was the best job I ever had before I went to law school. In some ways, it was the worst job. But it really opened my eyes, because when I was working there, I caught up with some former junior high and high school classmates who had been put away, who were incarcerated. And these were kids that I went to school with, went to the same church, grew up in the same neighborhoods. And seeing my classmates locked up was really one of those there before the grace of God go I moments. The bottom line is they got caught doing stupid things. I didn't. If I had, I could have been easily behind bars, given my family's financial circumstances. But the only difference I could see, besides I didn't get caught, was my parents, who kicked my butt and made me do all the things I didn't want to do, and kept me from doing the things I really wanted to do that likely would have gotten me in a lot of trouble. But my classmates weren't that lucky. I don't know what it was, their parents or what it was. They didn't have someone to set a curfew, hold them accountable. They got caught up with the wrong people, started doing drugs, became drug addicts, do the things drug addicts do to support their problems and their addiction, and became lifelong criminals in the eyes of the state. And they were locked up for many years. And when they did get out of prison, they couldn't find any way to get a job or have a meaningful way back into society. That was 35 years ago. But there are still, today, as we speak, many people like my former classmates who end up on the streets, stuck in a cycle of poverty, helplessness, and despair. And our current criminal justice system leads to so many suboptimal, destructive, and non-productive outcomes. Among the worst is how it traps people in hopelessness, even when they've paid their debt to society, because we never forgive the debt. People with criminal records often continue to pay the debt for the rest of their lives due to the pernicious collateral consequences that come with a criminal record that are imposed by various local, federal, and state governments. People with criminal records are kept from certain jobs, housing, loans, licenses, voting, and other basic needs. Across the United States, there are over 40,000 of those collateral consequences that exist today. Now, the definition of justice is just behavior or treatment, a concern for justice, peace, and genuine respect. Never forgiving a debt that has been repaid is not justice. It's literally the opposite of justice. People who have had a brush with the law and with the system, by and large, want to succeed and can succeed if we give them a chance. Instead, they're often still treated like they have the scarlet letter F for felon on their forehead for eternity. This harms society and our economy, and it also denies individuals the freedom they have worked so hard to regain. Again, Brian Stevenson sums it up very succinctly. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. That recognition and having humility will lead people to open their hearts and minds to men and women who are trying to start over and need a second chance. And let's be real, many of them never had a first chance. So what I'd like to do today is lay out briefly some of the ramifications of our current criminal justice system. I want to explain why reforms have strengthened and will continue to strengthen our long-term success as a nation, and highlight opportunities to make reforms for the incarcerated and returning citizens. At Koch, we look at this in three dimensions. There's the moral perspective. We have a two-tiered system, justice system. The rich and connected get a much better, rich and connected are treated better than the poor, who may be innocent. Rich people always get a better deal, regardless of guilt or innocence. We have a system where at least 2 federal judges have said recently that people plead guilty to things they didn't do because they can't afford to fight the government. They usually don't have a skilled lawyer, like my friend John Rapping and Gideon's Promise, to defend them. And they end up pleading to things they didn't do because they can't afford to fight the government. That is immoral. That is wrong. We look at it at the constitutional perspective. Almost half of the Bill of Rights deals with criminal justice issues, 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th Amendments, for sure. The founders were sending us a message: the biggest threat to life, liberty, and property in the pursuit of happiness was going to come through the criminal justice system. We haven't heeded their warning. And lastly, the fiscal perspective. And the fiscal case becomes the moral case. Because what happens is, and why the reforms started in Texas and have spread to 30-plus states now, and when governors who are accountable for their budgets look at how much they're spending on corrections, they peel back the numbers, they see who's in prison and for what, they find better ways to do things, more just ways to do things. And the fiscal case becomes the moral case, because if you're not spending a lot of money wasting it on people who don't need to be in prison or don't need to be in prison that long, you can spend it on schools, spend it on roads, you can spend it on mental health treatment, all these things that go lacking these days. So, bottom line, our current criminal justice system is the epitome of a failed big government program. It picks winners and losers, wastes billions of dollars every year, and ruins people's lives. And it actually fails to adequately do what a just criminal justice system should do: enhance public safety and give worthy individuals another chance to succeed, which also enhances public safety, because people who come out of prison better than when they went in are less likely to commit another crime. It keeps us safer. Our current challenges stem from the fact that we've been operating under many false assumptions. One, first, we believe that if the offender was locked up, we'd solve the problem. And the reality is we've just delayed it and oftentimes made it worse. Another false assumption is a top-down approach will solve local crises. Unfortunately, we're seeing this same approach today, at least from the Department of Justice, with the war on drugs. We made a bipartisan decision back in the 80s and 90s that the war on drugs could be won through locking up low-level offenders, low-level nonviolent drug offenders. It was a huge mistake. Drugs won the war on drugs. Drugs will win the war on drugs all the time. In fact, illegal drug use is at a higher rate and level today than it ever has been after 4 decades of the war on drugs. Now, there are many individuals who need to be in prison, who are part of the drug trade. I'll give you that. There are violent criminals. We need to incarcerate them, and some for a long time maybe. But we cannot incarcerate our way out of this. It just isn't going to work. Locking up addicts, users, and low-level offenders won't address the public health and mental health issues that drive drug addiction. It also won't address the lack of opportunity in some communities that leads people to make the decision to sell drugs. Declaring war on the mentally ill, on drug addicts, poor people, and nonviolent offenders does not solve the problem. It instead makes our fellow citizens who need our help, who are sick or poor, enemy combatants in the war on drugs. And that is unjust, idiotic, and self-defeating. Unsurprisingly, this top-down approach isn't based on data, isn't based on science or evidence. It's based on outdated rules and government bureaucracy and fear and emotion. A lot of what happened in the 80s and 90s was based on fear and emotion. The drug wars with angel dust, crack cocaine, dangerous drugs were out there, and we decided to use incarceration as a way to solve it. But fear and emotion is never a good way to make any decision, whether it's personal, business, or locking people up, taking away their liberty. Fear and emotion got us into this mess of mandatory minimums, despite the fact there is absolutely no data that supports it reduced the crime rate. None. There isn't. There's supposition, but no data. In contrast, the states have used data-driven and evidence-based reforms that have shown to reduce crime rates and incarceration rates. Texas alone has closed 8 prisons in the past 6 years and has one of its all-time low historic crime rates. What did the 80s and 90s policies lead to? Well, one was the massive over-criminalization of conduct throughout our society by the proliferation of federal and state criminal codes. We have so many federal laws, we don't know how many there are. General rule of thumb, if you have so much of something you don't know how much you have, you probably don't need it. And that doesn't count, there's 4,500 to 6,000 federal criminal laws, not including the state laws. We've got 300,000 criminal regulations out there, a lot of without intent standards, but we don't know because no one's ever taken the time to count them. And what do we have to show for this? Well, 1 in 3 adults in this country have some type of criminal record. That's more adults with criminal records and college degrees. We've got about 2 million people incarcerated in our country. We have 5% of the world's prison population, 25% of the world's, 5% of the population, 25% of the world's prison population. We're number 1 in incarceration. From 1990 to 2005, on average, the USA built a new state or federal prison or jail every 10 days. Approximately 1 in 100 adults are imprisoned in this country. When you combine the number of people incarcerated with those under probation or supervised relief, the number is 1 in 31 adults are under some type of correctional control in this country. We spend over $250 billion a year on our criminal justice system. We spend at least $80 billion, if not more, a year on incarceration, which is 3 to 4 times more per capita than we spend on education in this country. If you are what you eat, you're definitely what you spend, and by these numbers, we value incarcerating people more than we do educating them. And this obviously, as we all know here today, has a profound impact on children. Right now, there's close to 3 million children who have a parent currently incarcerated, and there are another several million who have had a parent incarcerated during their childhood. This obviously leads to adverse outcomes for them in the juvenile and adult systems. Up to 2/3, maybe more, will have their own issues, and they can't get help because in large part, our current criminal justice system destroys the communities and families that would have been there to help them. And it also contributes to poverty. A 2009 Villanova University study found that had we not incarcerated, over-incarcerated, mass incarcerated so many people as we have the 30-plus past years, poverty would have been reduced by 20%. So our current criminal justice system is literally impoverishing our society and hurts our economy by depriving us of jobs and economic productivity. Both the left and the right agree. They see this, they see the failures in the system, and we both agree it needs to be fixed with less government, not more. Another false assumption we've made is that people who have criminal records should be shut out from opportunity once they've paid their debt to society. Of the people who spend time behind bars, about 95% come out every year, are coming out. That's about 650,000 a year or so. Yet men with a criminal record represent 1/3 of working-age males who are jobless. Those individuals who finally are free from prison are now stuck to a virtual prison without borders or time limits because every possibility is shut off to them. This has a profound human cost as well. In 2009, DOJ found that a criminal record of any type reduced the likelihood of a job offer by 50%. We all know this, there's dignity in work. So this is more than a statistic. A job enables individuals to provide for themselves and their families, to take responsibility, use their talents, and contribute to their community. It gives them a lifeline back into our American family. And we are unjustly denying them that. Because individuals in need of a second chance can't find work, it hurts their chances to thrive and makes us less safe. Lack of employment is one of the reasons why more than 2/3 are rearrested, more than half are reconvicted, and 2 out of 5 are reincarcerated within 3 years of release. What's more, joblessness among those with a criminal record stifles our economy. A 2010 study by the Center for Economics and Policy Research estimated the annual lost economic value between $57 billion and $65 billion a year. The bottom line is our criminal justice system has an immense cost and not much return, quite frankly. And it has economic, financial, and most of all, human costs. And it's a cost we simply cannot afford to deal with anymore. These are just some of the reasons why so many states have reformed their systems the last 10 years. We at Koch, like you all out there, favor comprehensive reform from beginning to end. The laws that are passed, reining in the power of prosecutors. We need bail reform. People should be allowed to be free before trial as long as they're not a threat to public safety or a flight risk, period. It's consistent with the Eighth Amendment. Anything else to me is excessive bail, which is barred by the Eighth Amendment. We need a lot of sentencing reform. We need prison reform. We need Sixth Amendment indigent rights reform. I'd say we need reform, but the Sixth Amendment says you're supposed to get a lawyer. Gideon says you're supposed to get a lawyer. Juvenile cases say you're supposed to get a lawyer for juvenile defendants, but we don't do it. And that is a huge constitutional crisis that we need to address. But I want to focus my remaining time on prison reform and on reentry reform. And prison reform starts day one, meaning reentry starts day one. When the individual is incarcerated day one, there needs to be a plan for that individual to make them better, not worse. It needs to be implemented, it needs to be followed. And we know what works. It's not rocket science, it's not political science, it's common sense. Mentoring, someone who cares about you, jobs, education, drug treatment, mental health treatment, literacy training, financial literacy training, all these things, pretty simple. Every inmate needs a personalized plan that will set them up for success. We owe them that. We owe crime victims that. We owe our communities that. We owe our society that. The only job a prison really has is to make the person better, and the only metric that matters is recidivism rates. Reentry reform, the government can play a big role here. It can scale back the number of collateral consequences that exist to keep people out of jobs, housing, loans, etc. A lot of other things, though, government doesn't really have to be that involved. We do not need an act of Congress. We need an act of conscience for a lot of the issues that can be addressed through reentry reform. We need citizens and organizations to work to put people on a meaningful path to employment and help rebuild lives after they've had contact with the system. That's why at Koch we banned the box. We banned it a long time ago. I've been with the company 23 years. 23 years we've hired people with criminal records. We also signed on to the Obama White House's Fair Chance Business Pledge, and we hope that is continued by the Trump administration. I think it will be. We've found that getting to know the entire individual has worked for us in hiring the best people for the role, the best person. We don't overly fixate on something that a job candidate once did to the exclusion of who the person is now and what their total life experiences have been. This is a business necessity for us. It's a moral issue, but it's a business necessity, and it's win-win-win. It's good for the employer who gets a good employee, good for the individual who needs a second chance, and good for society because a good job reduces recidivism, which makes all of us, including law enforcement, safer. We've got about 120,000 employees at Koch, including more than 70,000 in the US and the rest in 60 countries around the world. We're in a global battle for talent, and we need the best people. Not the best people with or without a criminal record, just the best people, period. We've hired people with criminal records who are among our best employees. They're hungry, they're very talented, they're hardworking, they're grateful, they want to win. They're grinders, the type of people you root for. In contrast, we've hired individuals from the best schools, best job experience, best recommendations, and they're awful, terrible employees. They're whiny, they're entitled, they lack integrity, including many of who've stolen from us. So bottom line is we live in a very over-criminalized society. You can't judge a person by the mere fact they have a criminal record. As I mentioned earlier, 1 in 3 adults have one. So as an employer, in my opinion, it makes no sense to cut off the potential applicant pool by 1/3 just because someone has a criminal record. It's short-sighted from a business perspective. It's bad business, and it isn't good for society. So in closing, the reason criminal justice reform is so vital is because our nation will be safer, more just, and more prosperous if we recognize the dignity of each individual person, with or without a record. Otherwise, we risk becoming even more of a two-tier society, one that relegates those with any blemish on their past to a cycle of poverty and hopelessness. In the past decade, as I mentioned, more than half the states have passed a variety of reforms to change their system. The results speak for themselves. In the federal system, imprisonment rate increased 15% over the last decade, while the states fell by 4%. And it didn't lead to an increase in crime in the states. No fewer than 32 states saw drops in both the percentage of people imprisoned and the overall crime rate. So what does that mean? Put another way, Criminal justice reform makes us safer, makes us better. The states have shown you can reduce crime rates, reduce incarceration rates, keep communities safer, keep families together, and reduce recidivism, which keeps all of us, including law enforcement, safer. So criminal justice reform isn't about being tough on crime or soft on crime or any of that nonsense from 30, 40 years ago, whatever it is. It's about smart reforms, and it's about being smarter on crime and soft on taxpayers. And these reforms continue, as we see here today and yesterday, continue to unite people across the political spectrum, because we all recognize this issue is bigger than any red or blue divide. It's about transforming lives, restoring hope, and creating more opportunity for all, especially the least advantaged. Now, I know you all are here because you are proximate to these issues, but we all must do better. We owe it to our fellow Americans not to let them languish in correctional facilities without hope, without treatment, and without any possibility of redemption. That would be a monstrously immoral act that we just can't let happen. So I hope this conference can serve as a catalyst, and that the solutions and reforms we're going to discuss and have discussed will be carried out in Washington, D.C., the states and counties where reforms are still desperately needed. And we at Koch remain committed to working with all of you in pursuit of fair, just, effective, and constitutional reforms. Thank you very much, and may God bless.
Please welcome to the stage Mark Levin, former Governor Robert Ehrlich Jr., Alphonso David, Mary Ann SCALI, and Bishop Darrell Harris.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Mark Holden, a very good friend and a real visionary in this area, who has displayed tremendous leadership in bringing the private sector to this critical issue. So it's great to be here. I'm Mark Levin with Right on Crime, and we have a tremendous panel here today to address the issue of recidivism. And let me just introduce them, and then I'll say a few words, and we'll get into the substance of our discussion. Governor Bob Ehrlich, who I think virtually all of you are probably familiar with, served as governor of Maryland in a very distinguished manner. What you may not know is he was also a congressman and state legislator before that. He currently is senior counsel at King & Spalding Law Firm in Washington, and one of the areas that he has really pioneered is the issue of executive clemency, and indeed he founded a clinic on executive clemency at the Catholic University Law School in Washington that is doing tremendous work. And of course, we recently saw some very impressive gains in the clemency area as far as federal offenders, and governors need to do more in that area as well. So thank you for your leadership on that. Alphonso David is chief counsel to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, and he has played a major role on some really important issues here in New York, including Raise the Age, which I and many of us here worked on, and also, of course, the issue of higher education for people who are incarcerated. And I think that Governor Cuomo's leadership, thanks to Alphonso, was critical in really putting that on the map and now leading to the federal pilot program in that area. Before that, he was chief counsel for civil rights, cabinet secretary for civil rights under Governor Cuomo, and prior to that was staff attorney at the Lambda Legal Defense Fund, and he's also an adjunct professor at the Cardozo School of Law. Mary Ann SCALI also joins us, who's executive director for the National Juvenile Defender Center. Previously, she was an attorney and social worker for the Baltimore Office of Public Defender. She's been a true leader on the issue of right to counsel for juveniles, which too often is not observed in many parts of the country, even for kids who are facing significant time in detention and post-adjudication facilities. So we really appreciate her visionary work on that. Finally, we have Darrell Harris, who's founder of TLC Ministries in Detroit. He also serves as the Human Rights Commissioner for the City of Detroit, and he's had decades of experience as a life coach, addressing such very difficult issues as domestic violence, and he has grown this ministry from something operating out of his house to serving a tremendous number of people in Detroit and making an incredible difference in that community, so thank you. On this issue of reducing recidivism, I really think it's a challenge for all of us, and one of the ways we need to start is by defining recidivism. it could be a technical violation for somebody who's on probation, like missing an appointment or a positive drug test or leaving the county without permission or having a beer. Or it could be a violent offense and a spectrum of everything in between. And one of the other issues is having an apples-to-apples comparison, and this has to do with both the people involved as well as the jurisdiction. So it's often been said for low-risk offenders, someone could start a lemonade stand and have a low recidivism rate, but it doesn't really mean the lemonade stand is having a causal impact on that person's behavior. They were already a very low risk to recidivate. And then there's the issue of jurisdictions. Jurisdictions that over-incarcerate to a very high degree may indeed show a lower recidivism rate for their prisons, but that's because they were putting low-risk people who probably shouldn't have been in prison to begin with behind bars. So when you compare recidivism from different counties or different states, if you don't adjust for the risk level of the people involved, you will come to conclusions that may not be accurate. And the same applies to probation caseloads. If one county is putting more challenging people on probation to begin with, it's not surprising they might have a higher recidivism rate. So I think that, you know, I'd like to turn to the panel now and kind of ask them about, first of all, what approaches they see as promising in this area, given that, you know, Newt Gingrich, who's one of our signatories for Right on Crime, along with Governor Ehrlich, said, if 2/3 of the bridges we built in this country fell down within 5 years, it would be a national scandal. But that, in fact, is the recidivism rate in many places, again, depending on if you broadly define it. So, Governor Ehrlich, let me ask you first, what do you think is the promising approaches?
I think that your first point is really well taken. People need to understand, I think it's worth repeating with regard to apples, oranges to oranges. You can manipulate statistics. Politicians tend to do that. I know. Not me. But that's a very good point, who we're putting in jail and why. I just see this as a process. It's not an event. It's a process. So to me, it was sort of sentencing reform, pillar 1, collateral consequences, pillar 2, and pillar 3, I should say, and pillar 2 is everything in between. It's incarceration, but everything about incarceration leads to what? Reentry. Whether it's cognitive therapy, whether it's job training, whether it's education, whatever. So we saw this as sort of the pillar 2 with regard to our approach to criminal justice reform. It wasn't a single event. It wasn't a singular event. It was, in fact, a process. And we measured it, obviously, quite carefully, as now governors happen to be doing. We're going to get into strategies later and all that. My wife now is a juvenile prosecutor drug court in Annapolis, Maryland. We started drug courts during my administration. So you know, there's a lot of innovative activities being done at the state level. Governors are leading as usual. But as far as reentry and the issue of recidivism and all that, in my view, this is a process that begins on first day of incarceration and obviously and then concludes when the offender reenters.
Yeah, and Alphonso, let me turn it to you. And part of it is also not just recidivism, but obviously positive outcomes like employment, vocational, educational, et cetera.
I completely agree. I think when we think about recidivism, I think about this issue in terms of 2 different perspectives. One is you really have to change the paradigm, the philosophy of how we think about recidivism and rehabilitation. And then second, to the governor's point, you do have to completely deconstruct and put back together a process. So in New York, at least, we've been looking at ATI programs, alternative to incarceration programs, to make sure that we're providing services and resources to those that may be at risk to commit crimes. Then, when someone is unfortunately arrested and incarcerated, we have to make sure that we really think about what kinds of services and resources we're providing when they are incarcerated. And that ranges from vocational programming to college courses to really deconstructing how prison officials really think about the concept of rehabilitation. There are some in this country that still think about when you go to prison, you're supposed to be punished, and that it's not an institution that is supposed to, quote, correct you, or an institution that's supposed to rehabilitate you. So you really have to change that philosophy for those that are managing individuals that are incarcerated. And then finally, when you are released from prison, of course, we have to make sure that we have an infrastructure to support you. You know, it's fascinating what people talk about when they say, well, you committed a crime and you've served 30 years in prison, and when you're released, we have no responsibility to support you. Well then, if that's the case, we're essentially saying that we don't really believe in rehabilitation, because if someone is incarcerated for 30 years, they will be released in many cases without the skills that they need to compete, without a bank account, without any support, in some cases no housing. So if we're not creating an infrastructure to support them when they're released, we really don't believe in rehabilitation. And in essence, what we're saying is we're creating a revolving door of criminality, because if you're arrested, you're incarcerated, we don't provide you the services and resources you need, you're released without any support, in many cases you will go back to committing additional crime, and then as taxpayers, we end up spending more money, incarcerating more people, and it's cyclical and nonsensical. So I think we have to both think about changing the philosophy of how we think about rehabilitation and recidivism, and also completely deconstruct our process.
Yes, we'll just go on down then.
Okay. Thanks so much. So thank you for inviting the conversation and including youth justice in this piece of the conversation about recidivism. And the urgency in terms of shifting the paradigm, as Alphonso just said, is even more critical when we talk about youth. In the words of Nelson Mandela, there's no keener revelation into a society's soul than in the way it treats its children. And what we need to do to impact recidivism is shift our treatment of youth behavior. We as a nation arrest children for behavior that is mostly nonviolent. Almost 75% of children who are arrested for things like cursing in school, disobedience, loitering, drug violations, public disorder offenses. Less than 25% of the children who we bring in are arrested for person offenses. And then what do? What has our society decided is the right response? We incarcerate them at a rate that is the highest in the entire world. Twice the rate of the next highest nation, which is Cyprus. We've gotten better. 10 years ago, we were 5 times the rate of the next highest nation in the world. So we're making progress in the youth arena. But what we also don't do when we bring them in and arrest them and incarcerate them is give them great lawyers, people who give voice to their humanity, who tell their stories, who talk to them about their dreams, their wishes, what you talk to your children about, what we all talk to our children about, and give them a pathway to opportunity and education. Because what we also knew is let the clutches of the court trap our children with fines and fees, with collateral consequences, with the idea that they are no better than the place we put them in a facility. So what do we have to do? We have to look at the research. Dr. Ed Mulvey's with us. What does the research say? It says that most children's delinquent behavior desists just a few years after bringing them in. So what are we doing? We're trapping our children in a cycle. What else does the research say? That the opportunity of adolescence is the last great chance we have to pave towards jobs and opportunities. But instead, we're paving pathways to jails, incarceration, shackling, strip searching. It is time for the reckoning of the soul of America, because what we do to children in this system is immoral. And how do we address recidivism? We turn back the way that we think about who our children are. We look at adolescence as an opportunity. We give them great lawyers who lift their humanity up and help them dream. And we let them succeed, because what we're doing now just inhibits it.
Amen to that.
Even as a preacher, that's a hard act to follow. I also believe that it's a twofold situation. And coming from my background, which is largely that of spirituality, I believe that the first one is there. At the very fundamental core of the concept of incarceration, as was previously mentioned, was this idea of reform, was this idea of rehabilitation. It has been a fundamental concept to it, but it has not been a manifested concept. When I say that, I mean that everything about incarceration at a time where you have a person in the most vulnerable situations where you can begin to truly work with their spirituality. And I don't mean religiosity, but I mean spirituality, which are the fundamental causes of why a person might be incarcerated in the first place, outside of those very basic, simple things just mentioned. When you think of concepts spiritually like forgiveness, mercy, true love, and an understanding of that, how to work out situations verbally as opposed to violently. And once a person has been incarcerated for those things, when you have them at the most vulnerable stage, we do not do our best to start the reform process, although inherently it's built into the criminal justice system of incarceration. We don't utilize that time at its core to really get to that sense and begin to develop and change the individual, to reform him, to reform her, rehabilitate in these areas. And largely that leads into the second part of the conversation for me, which is as long as our prison system is operating under somewhat of a privatized mantle, then I do not believe that it is going to be possible to truly return to this idea of true reform, because the idea of privatization is to make money. And therefore, you're going to make absolutely sure that the roads that take you out are going to lead back in, because the idea is monetized. And so as long as that is a fundamental practice in this area, then I think that it is going to be impossible to truly see recidivism numbers go down, because as you let a person out the prison, you have not done the best and put the most money into what really counts, which is the idea and the concept of reformation. Once that is ignored, then when you release a person, the road, see, for me, the problem is that real reformation and transformation doesn't start until you get out of prison, when it's supposed to start when you're in prison. And if that idea is missed, then what you have returning back to the streets is a person now who's more angry because he's done time, but he hasn't been reformed. And then you let him back out on the street and expect society to reform him, when we're looking and saying, isn't that what you do? So I think that we have to do something about the privatization of prisons, because if we don't do something about that, it is going to always be inherent that those roads are going to return a person back to whence they come.
Governor, did you want to add something?
I just, we can all of us, I think, just made some really good points, and applause, and everybody shakes their head, but I also think we need to try to get more practical as well, as far as some of the practical obstacles that we face in the real world today. For example, as a young state legislator in the 80s and 90s in Maryland, I have a specific recollection of debates in our committee with regard to what predicate offenses we would add into our juvenile waiver statute in order to, what? Increase the number of juveniles, what? Waived up into our adult system, right? To the extent, and that was part of the national movement. Obviously, state legislatures across the country were doing it. It was a tough on crime. It was a reaction
John
to
DeLulio.
drugs and all that stuff. Absolutely. So, and those statutes are still in the books in many cases. So to the extent you have overrepresentation today, it is a function of debates that occurred 10, 20, 25 years ago with regard to increasing those predicate offenses. And in the process, you lost a lot of kids, because to the extent you can keep kids in the juvenile system, you have a better chance of saving them as opposed to the adult system, where they're doing real time, longer time. Fact. Secondly, as governor, when we tried some of these innovative approaches, we had a program called Restart, and this cognitive redevelopment program is behind bars, and a Republican governor doing it. It's like, oh my, people's heads were exploding, and what are you doing? But one of my practical problems was the unions, was the correctional. Is this a familiar? was union resistance. You know, we're not therapists, we're not psychologists, we're not psychiatrists, we're correctional officers. We're not here to coddle prisoners. Very serious, and when that political pressure was brought to bear in the legislature, negative consequences follow, and we did not get beyond some of the model programs we wanted as a result of simply the politics of it. And then a third observation with regard to practical issues. This is from lots of criminal defense lawyers I know, and particularly the one I've been married to for 24 years. With regard to recidivism and reentry, it's too often reentry into the same neighborhood, the same environment that caused the problems in the first place, right? And so, again, practical problems that we need to address today, not just sort of high-sounding speeches, but just practical problems that policymakers face every day.
Just want to briefly add on to what the governor just said, because it is so true. Just two examples, just to supplement what was said earlier. As many of you know, we reformed the solitary confinement system here in New York a few years ago. There was a lawsuit initiated by the NYCLU. The governor was very concerned about litigating that case and said, no, we will settle this case and actually reform our entire system. So we reformed the solitary confinement system. Pregnant women no longer, shocking, but they were put in solitary confinement for years. Kids under the age of 18 were also placed in solitary confinement for years. That's no longer the case in New York. And then we also refined the system. After we settled the lawsuit, within a week or two, we were sued by the corrections associations. The correctional officers sued us because their position was, if you refine the solitary confinement system, you are exposing us to risk. There's no evidence to support that. There's no data to support that, but there was a lawsuit. They subsequently resolved the litigation because they realized that they had no claim, but nevertheless, we had substantial pushback from the officers that are responsible for overseeing the correctional system. And that's not unique to New York. You see that across the country. Second, I agree with you with respect to privatizing prisons. But I also think it's important for us not to lose sight of the fact that we also have a substantial amount of pushback from elected officials. In New York is one example. We've closed 24 adult and juvenile facilities in New York. More than 5,000 beds have been shut down. But one of the reasons why it was so difficult to do is because in many of those counties and districts where those facilities are located, it's the economy. It's the jobs. So when you close down those prison facilities and those beds without creating another infrastructure to allow those who live in those communities to thrive, you will get a substantial amount of opposition. So as we think about how do we move forward and think about modernizing our criminal justice system and our prison population, educating them and making sure they have the services and resources, is not only about the private marketplace, it's also about those that are within government that oppose what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up the solitary confinement one, because there's some states that are still releasing people directly from solitary confinement to the streets, which is proven to increase recidivism. And the broader question is, and it comes up with the collateral consequences, how do we stop doing the things we know actually increase recidivism? It's the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, right, which we don't follow in the criminal justice system. So, and maybe you could talk about that in the juvenile system as well.
Yeah, so I also wanted to pick up on Governor Ehrlich's statements about let's get practical about what are the strategies that we really can use and employ to make changes. So he spoke about the transfer laws that haven't been rolled back in many states, but have in over a dozen states, almost 25 states, I think at this point, have looked at those laws and rolled back. That's something that we can do, that we can get agreement on. We know that the evidence says transferring children to adult court doesn't work. It leads to worse outcomes for communities and for young people. So, and in terms of the communities and what we know about the communities our young people are coming from is all those dollars we're spending, $90,000, $121,000, $124,000, depending on the state, per child, per year in a facility. If we took those dollars and invested in our communities, empowered our communities to participate in the process of what's happening in the court system so that we can work together actually to transform individual lives as well as broader community lives, then we see recidivism rates decrease. Because what we know what works with young people, they have to be connected to people in their communities, strong connections. We have to give them opportunities to build their skills, right? So to provide education, it's critical. Carlos said that yesterday. I don't know if he's here today. Most important thing we can do is build up educational opportunities. So what are specific strategies we can employ for recidivism for children are things that we know how to do. Things that I think today, especially, there is less political challenge in the youth arena. We do have facilities where there's pushback on what are we going to do. And our answer to that is we're going to shift you who are working in those facilities and give you different kinds of training. We haven't done that well. I agree with you, Governor. But I think it's something we can do. And if we shift the funds, we can actually do it well.
But part of it is dealing with the unions. And it is.
Right.
And further to the point about incarceration as an economic development initiative in Western Maryland, as you know, it is the #1 employer, correctional officer, because of all the institutions out there. So it's a real practical political problem that leaders deal with.
Well, Darrell, can I also ask you about kind of, as we can talk about the different government programs, and frankly, there's a need to shift resources from incarceration in many places to reentry, for example. But how do we involve, folks like you, especially mentoring programs, for example, in the sense that the government can't love someone, it's going to take another person to come alongside that person in many cases?
Well, truthfully, and I agree with what everyone is saying, I know that this is a very complex situation. This is not something that's going to be solved overnight with just 4 people sitting on a panel. I do understand that. But I applaud the fact that this entire symposium, because all the information that I've heard is good and is usable, and that there would be people who would dare to even come together and challenge the system, even though there are those pushbacks and those hardships. I think that is wonderful and it is great. One of the things that's also changed in the sense of privatization, in the sense of incarceration and the fundamental idea of reform changing, is this concept of what it does to the spiritual work being done in prisons. For example, back in the 1970s, it was fairly simple for a number of churches or different religious institutions to literally perform ministry in these edifices, in these prisons. Now that rate of actually getting church to be involved in that program has been minimalized. When you go to most of your prisons, and I talk to a lot of pastors just in the city of Detroit, which, by the way, we started the construction on a brand new prison on the inside of the city of Detroit, that the work has been laid dormant now for about 6 or 7 years. The building is just sitting there, and because of this kind of pushback in what you're referring to. But when I talk to a lot of pastors, I talk to a lot of persons who provide spiritual ministry that is at the root of Reformation. And I want to make sure to say that it is we had an entire period called the Reformation, right? So it's at the root of Reformation that you speak of spirituality being involved. And yet it is very complicated. The entire system has ratified itself in making it easy and non-complicated to have these religious institutions perform ministries inside of prisons, inside of jails. Not to say that it doesn't happen, but I'm saying the process has been hardened even the more. And when that process becomes hardened, it makes it difficult to start those programs inside of prison, as opposing to waiting until someone gets out of prison to begin those programs. When a person is released from prison, I'm sorry, but the last thing on their mind is improvement of spirituality. The first thing on their mind is living, surviving. And so to catch them at that point, it's literally ludicrous to think that I'm going to be able to sit down with someone who's just done 17, 18 years in prison, done juvenile stints in prison, received no sort of spiritual reformation to begin that process, and then sit down and have a conversation with him about Jesus loves him. I mean, it's very difficult to do that. And so I believe that we have to find a way to where we can go back to making it simpler for religious institutions to participate inside of the prison in those kinds of programs that are reforming.
Absolutely. Faith-based initiatives and all, I don't know what you all are doing in New York, but in a lot of states now, obviously, we had one as well. 2 very different points. One, along the same lines, President Obama had a White House conference a couple years ago, fatherlessness, the importance of fathers. There's a lot of really good fatherlessness programs out there that should be supported, real important. And then just a little thought with regard to my former job. And you have this sort of weird dichotomy with regard to executives around the country. And that is some governors still fear collateral consequences. They fear providing relief. They fear granting pardons. They fear granting commutations. Commutations are hard. A pardon generally is pretty easy. Someone has a DWI 20 years ago, they need a clean record to get in Maryland, particularly trying to get a job with the federal government, not hard. A commutation with regard to someone doing a life sentence, if you look at the record and the record starts to smell, if you know what I mean, certain things about the case smell, and you think someone deserves to have their sentence commuted in order to qualify for parole, and you call the former judge, the former prosecutor, and they go crazy, right? Happens all the time. And suddenly, and your staff is saying, we need this like a hole in the head. Is the Washington Post going to cover this? And Willie Horton still lives. The Willie Hortonization of this process still lives, and that's fear. And and no one deserves a medal, because if you run for governor, you are a governor, you take the heat. But there's still fear out there with regard to some executives, not all, around this country, with regard to what executives have always done in the history of our country until recently, which is provide collateral relief in the criminal justice system. And somehow it's fallen out of favor at the executive level, at the state and federal level in modern times.
Well, let me add, one of the most obvious research findings from all the empirical studies has been the length of time someone's incarcerated does not correlate with reducing recidivism. So, I mean, obviously some people have to stay in order because they're at risk of committing additional serious crimes. But, you know, and of course this is actually in the juvenile system, I think, why a lot of states have said you could complete whatever program there is in the juvenile facility in 6 months. We shouldn't be holding you longer than that. But obviously in the adult system, it's still a struggle to get through. But one of the issues, and maybe you or Alphonso could address this given your prior experience in the public sector, but how do we get the coordinate the different levels of government in this area? Because you have cities and counties that don't know who's coming back to their communities. So how do we engage them, not just think of it as a state problem when it comes to reducing recidivism?
I just wanted to make one, I'll let you handle that, but as far as coming back, and a point I wanted to make earlier, coming back means, for lack of a better term, safety net, and that means having local business organizations involved. It means having local chambers involved. You know, there are some employers in Annapolis, Maryland, who want offenders, who actually go out of their way to hire, but there's no sort of process whereby those employers can be identified. It's sort of ad hoc. I don't know what you're doing. I'm interested to hear what you're doing in New York, but to the extent you can get entities that count, particularly employers, I love the point about when you're getting out, you're not thinking about Jesus, you're thinking about where's my next meal, can I get a job, can I stay on the straight and narrow, and do I have to go back to where I was, which was part of the problem in the first place?
It's a complex question to answer, because I think there's so many different pieces to it. The first is, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that not every single elected official supports the approach that we've taken, at least in New York, on criminal justice reform. So when we talk about people leaving prison and re-entering into their local communities, there are some elected officials that may not be as supportive as others. And in large part because I think, more so than any other area of law that I focus on, criminal justice, and at least public policy that drives criminal justice, is driven by fear. It's not driven by data. It's not driven by the science. It's all driven by fear. And when we talk about reforming the criminal justice system, and I talk to elected officials, more often than not, they're often talking to me about their fear of what could happen, their fear of the sky falling, their fear of releasing someone and that person commits another crime, their fear of their constituents being upset with them for voting a certain way. So it's all really driven by fear. When we provide the data that says, well, this is the data, this is the science, there is disbelief. There is this is not real. This is not applicable to New York. And they will take the research and the data and try to deconstruct it in a way so that it doesn't apply, so that it just furthers their fear. So when we think about building relationships between the state and the local government and the municipality, we're thinking about what is the most persuasive construct that we can use to get everyone to support the approach that we're taking. We adopted a program a few years ago, and President Obama actually applauded it. It's called Work for Success. And we've hired more than 18,000 people through the program. The program does is identify people that are going to be eligible for parole, identify skills that they may have, connect them to not-for-profit organizations that will help them further support their skills, identify specific interests that they have, and connect them to employers. We've had more than, I believe, 14,000 employers participate in the program and 18,000 people hired. That's a huge success story in New York. And we use that information and that data to support new legislation that we're trying to advance in New York to say, we should actually support, pre-release programs. We should support, we should modify the statute so that some felonies are eligible for certain types of pre-release programs. Some elected officials are still not convinced, but I think that as we go through the process, we have to go into their specific districts, identify examples in their districts, and then use them to hopefully help us advance legislation. But it's not easy because, we live in a state in New York where we have some of the most conservative elected officials and some of the most liberal elected officials. And the goal is to try to make them focus on the data so that we can advance criminal justice reform, and it's not easy.
Just speaking of which, just a practical issue, and let me just take you inside, practical problem. As governor of Maryland, and you're sitting there with your staff, and they're saying, why are we doing this? And the right is out there, my conservative friends in the legislature saying, we got better things to do than this? And my friends on the left are saying privately, hey, Bobby, go. This is great, but we can't give you any credit because, you're a Republican. And then your staff is saying, by the way, this person we just gave this collateral relief to, can we make sure the third cousin never wrote a $25 check in some campaign you ran for the House of Delegates 20 years ago? Because the press will find it. So there are all sorts of practical difficulties in getting governors to lead on this issue. And they're not dumb concerns. They're real concerns. But again, if you're interested in justice, real justice, serious justice, you're going to engage. But there are practical challenges.
Yeah, Mary Ann, let me ask you, because I know we're talking about reducing recidivism, but part of your work and the work I think that all of us have focused on is, in some cases, particularly for short stays, which are even more common in the juvenile system, somebody goes to a juvenile facility or an adult facility. In some cases, it's for a few months. But in other cases, and especially in the juvenile system, it could be for a week or two, but it's enough time to become disconnected from their family, from their school, and you can have a counterproductive effect of increasing recidivism. So how do we address that?
Well, I think you answered the question with your question, was we shouldn't be locking up young people for any period of time. We should go to the zero campaign we heard about yesterday. But if we are going to persist with these policies, it makes our reconnecting children even more important. Again, they need great lawyers who understand they can go to the school board and say, let's get back into local schools. Schools shouldn't be putting children out. We should ensure they have housing. The homelessness issue of youth who are in juvenile justice is significant. We should ensure that we're taking care of their legal needs, having civil legal attorneys partner with juvenile defenders, ensuring that we're meeting those needs. But the bottom line is, Mark, exactly what you just said. We're doing this. It increases recidivism. Why are we doing it?
Let me just conclude with you, Darrell. What about, if you could address the role of neighborhoods? You talked about how people go back to the same places. How can we change some of those dynamics there?
So I'd really like to just throw this in because I heard earlier, and I just want to make sure that from the standpoint, precipice, that I'm entering this conversation, there is, just to your point, Mr. David, there is tons of evidence that show how spiritual programs impacted in the right way reduce recidivism. Yet, when you show this material, I mean, you have programs like Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. You've got programs like this that are spiritually based, literally transforming hundreds of thousands of lives. And yet, when we go in to, get programs that will help with the recidivism or will prepare young people to come out, we constantly ignore the spiritual programs that show the most effect in being able to reduce this recidivism. Because with a spiritual program, you're not adding something to someone's hands, you're adding something to someone's heart. And when you change a person's heart, now you can give them the kind of job that they need, you can give them the education that they need and all those things, and they'll use it for good. But if you give a person with a bad heart a job, that doesn't mean that he's gonna do good. As a matter of fact, it's what flows out of his heart that's gonna cause the direction that he's gonna take with whatever you give him. So I am a large advocate for spiritual types of programs that, I'm not against giving jobs. I believe that that is a part of it. I'm not against giving education opportunities. That's a huge part of it. But again, until someone does something with the heart, everybody's gonna be living in fear. Not just the politicians, but the people who are coming back on the streets as well. And one of the things that spiritual training does is it helps people to cope with, deal with, eradicate, and overcome fear. Now, with that being said, I think that getting to your point, so I live and pastor in a neighborhood. It's called 48205 in the city of Detroit. It is also nicknamed 482 Die. It is said, and it was said by CNN News about 10 years ago, that the area in which I pastor and live has the highest number not only of returning citizens in the city of Detroit from all over the state, but it also had the highest number of murder per capita. We're only about 5 square miles, and yet a majority of the murders that take place in the city of Detroit happen in 48205. So I am directly impacting and impacted by persons who have been afflicted by this system. And when you begin to talk about things in the neighborhood that's necessary, one of the things that I've incorporated is how about somebody ask them what they need, as opposed to always coming to the table with this idea that we know what's best. How about somebody sit down with that person who was born in a prison because their mother was in confinement, who I pastor several. I started a group in my congregation called The Restored, because I found out that I had several young adults who had been born in prison, and now they were sitting in church after having gone through the systems and things like that, and they needed to be restored. We were talking about rehabilitation for their parents. They were the ones who were broken just as well. And so I believe that neighborhoods are impacted heavily by it. I am one that can speak to that end, and I think that we need more programs that are born out of the ideas that come from the persons who have been affected by the system, not necessarily by persons who are sitting at the top, who have the privilege to be fearful and not participate in the system.
Well, thank you to everyone on the panel here. We have almost 10 minutes left for questions from the audience, so I'd like to go in that direction now. Okay, down here. Is there a mic out there, or I guess, let's see. There it comes. Oh, okay.
A lot of the things that you're wanting to have happen require us to continue to have Medicaid expansion, and the benefits of the Affordable Care Act in order to provide the kinds of services. I heard before, it's like the left and the right agree about all these things, but it doesn't seem to me that everybody is in agreement that we need to continue to have the kind of care that is required for people leaving prison. In particular, the fastest growing population in most of our prisons are older adults who need a significant amount of care. And if we continue down the path of repealing the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion, that's all at risk. So how are your organizations approaching that as a key component of criminal justice reform?
Sure. Well, and I'll just mention, you might look at a bill that was passed in Texas this session, which we supported, which basically prevents people's benefits, whether it's disability or Medicaid, from being terminated automatically while they're in jail for, up to 30 days, which is the federal. After 30 days, they have to do it. But the problem is the sheriffs were reporting them, and the sheriffs get money, by the way, for the federal government for doing that. But they were reporting them even after a day or two in jail. But let me turn it over to panel.
So I know on my end, the church has a dual responsibility, or at least has taken a dual responsibility, because on the one hand, we stand as human rights activists. I mean, the church is the oldest nonprofit in the world. And so for us to stand with human rights issues and to try to really push forward to our politicians to allow them to know that we need them to be leaders, not politicians. We need them to lead the way and not just go by what is going to be popular. But on the other end of that spectrum, we're also expected to be philanthropic. And so doing programs like Forgotten Harvest and other programs that help to feed and everything until we are able to take care of. We have some of the largest medical fairs in the city of Detroit are really under the auspice of many of the churches who are there. So trying to just approach that situation, but the average pastor is afraid in that area because we feel like we have so very little to really offer. Most of us are theologians. We're not necessarily trained at the finer arts of, deciding policy or whatnot. But we do recognize our importance in that fight to use our influence as best as we can to provide that support for the better ideas in that area of medical health care.
To answer your question, I think what we're doing is getting ready to sue. And we have been for a while. We're preparing on a number of different fronts to challenge some of the Trump policies because we think that they disproportionately target New York. We think they disproportionately target minorities and people of color. And in some cases, disproportionately target women. So I can't sort of get into the details, but at this point, we don't really see a clear path to repealing the Affordable Care Act. That could, of course, change. To the extent it does, we are looking at a variety of different options to make sure that New Yorkers are protected. That's sort of as much as I can
With
say.
regard to Medicaid, I'm sorry, you don't want to hear this, but as a governor and sitting there at my staff coming to my office and begging the federal government to get some waiver with regard to exactly what we're talking about here. And the system doesn't work very well. So in order to devolve Medicaid to the state level and have governors actually do what you think you can do at the state level to meet the needs of your local population, in my view, is good public policy. You can debate all we want about the rest of the Affordable Care Act, but with regard to devolving Medicaid to the state level and having a piece of change from the federal government, and federal government telling governors, allowing governors to actually meet the needs of their local communities as best they understand them, in my view, is policy in the right direction.
Do we have some other questions?
Good morning, Jasmine Heiss from the Coalition for Public Safety. Thank you all so much for your words and thoughts this morning. I want to return to for a moment to this conversation about unions and prison employment and prison labor. And just note that I think that the Federal Bureau of Prisons reduction of solitary confinement had buy-in from the prison guards, so that's perhaps a model to look at. But more broadly, a question for the panel: how does certain communities' over-reliance on incarceration as an economic driver challenge us all to think about the way in which many poor communities deserve more than a prison job that isn't serving them as much as it could?
Well, diversification of your economic base is the answer, right? Is that the, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm happy to answer that question. I mean, I think what we've done successfully here in New York when we closed the 24 adult and juvenile detention facilities and prison facilities is we took a step back. This wasn't only about a criminal justice reform policy, it was also an economic development policy. So in all of those jurisdictions, all of those districts where we closed the prisons, we actually had our economic development team go in and do an assessment of those neighborhoods and try to find out, are there economies that we could bring in? Are there industries that would be interested in coming into these communities to try to transform the culture, the environment in those communities? What we have to recognize, though, and New York is not unique here, is for decades we have been building prisons in communities where there were no jobs. That was the economic development policy of the past. So when we close these prisons, we have to completely shift how we've been thinking about providing resources, services, support, really thinking about the infrastructure in those neighborhoods. And we're doing that successfully. But you have to go into each, because it's really bizarre, but I mean, it makes sense, I guess, to some extent. You go into each of those neighborhoods, and although you could assume that they're basically all the same, because they're all supported by that one prison facility, there are actually unique needs for each of those communities, and you have to think about if there's an industry that comes in here, if there's an employer that builds a facility, whether or not it will succeed, and whether or not the people in those communities have the skills to actually successfully compete. So we've done that, and we will continue to do that in New York.
The problem, I think, just like upstate New York, the problem in Western Maryland is the manufacturers were there, and then they closed. So it wasn't sort of what came first. And so, look, there's dignity in work. And these are real jobs, and they're important jobs, so you're not going to degrade the jobs or the people doing them. But it's diversification of your employment base. Obviously, that's what governors do. You go out and you take your economic development folks and you figure out and you go around the world literally negotiating, begging employers, manufacturers to come to this particular area, Western Maryland, and here's why. So you don't want to, you're not going to degrade, obviously, the folks there and the jobs and their important public safety jobs they have, but if you're, it's like anything, by the way, to the extent you're dependent on just one employer, you're going to have a problem in the long term.
Yeah, and let me just say the one issue we encounter in Texas is, I think Mary Ann mentioned the great idea of having some of these folks, they could be probation officers, because we may have more people on probation, but you actually need a college degree to do that, whereas in Texas you don't have to have that to be a prison guard. Do we have one more question, perhaps? Down here?
Hi, thank you. Jose Was with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the Quakers. I did want to mention that we see all over the news that Congress has gotten nothing done, but there's been a bill that's been ready to go to the president's desk for months now, and there's one senator that's holding it up, and that's the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act that gives grants to states and then provides guidance to foster a restorative justice model to not lock kids up. But Senator Tom Cotton really likes locking up people, especially kids. So I would love to have folks mention the importance of juvenile justice. And then my one very quick question would be to Governor Ehrlich. 44,000 collateral consequences, and there are 3 that exist at the federal level. The collateral bans on TANF, SNAP, and Pell. More than a third of states have lifted those collateral bans, and every time that I speak to senators and Congress people and their staff, any conversation of that is pretty much shut down by we need reforms and we need to cut these programs. So if folks, especially Governor Ehrlich, would be able to speak to those collateral bans, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Collateral benefit, well, I agree with you. So I don't know what you want me to. With regard to states, it's just a function of individual governors and their particular philosophical approach. So. Since we agree, I can't argue with you.
Well, Mary Ann, he mentioned juvenile and the JJDPA.
Right, so I'm so glad you brought that up because I was trying to figure out how to get JJDPA reauthorization onto a recidivism panel. So yes, it's unconscionable. It hasn't been reauthorized since 2002. If you know your representatives should push, you should be making phone calls. I'm not actually supposed to be saying that. Think about what could happen if we actually reauthorize JJDPA. Do some education yourself on the issue. But I also just wanted to make one last point about the humanity of this conversation. So when we're talking about recidivism, when we're talking about things like unions, if we could transfer the skills of people who are working in institutions to people working in communities, think about what we could do in our communities to really undo these systems, to break them down, as someone said yesterday. We have people with jobs, but they want to do better, different, more human jobs that actually allow them to also help lift up their community members. Being a person who works in an institution, Mark Holden said it was one of the best jobs he had. But it was a job that he loved because he got to see and talk to people that he knew and actually make a difference in their lives. If our people were in communities like juvenile defenders, lifting up voices of people, like pastors lifting up voices of people, I think that's where the root of all this comes from.
Can I, if I can
sure,
just supplement
and then
that, because
we'll probably
I
have to wrap up.
completely agree. We have 54 prisons in New York State. I've traveled to the majority of those prisons. And I can tell you every single time I walk into a prison facility, I'm shocked. I shouldn't be, because I've gone to too many of them. But I am a black man walking into a prison facility that in most cases are being operated by white correctional officers. We cannot underestimate how significant that is. We have black and brown faces. We have black and brown faces that in many cases are transported upstate for a variety of different reasons. They're incarcerated upstate. And because of the demographics upstate, the people that live in those communities happen to be the people that work in those correctional facilities. When we think about transforming the community, when we think about how do we really sort of restart this conversation, that has to be a part of it. We have to start talking about the impact of race and ethnicity when we think about the criminal justice reform process, practically and philosophically as well.
And that is so important, because when you talk about, again, I love the mentioning of the concept of transforming a community. But you have got to allow that community to participate in that conversation. You cannot just send, especially with the ethnic disparities, you have got to have a conversation with them and allow them the opportunity to participate in that, especially juveniles, especially young people. We often think that they don't have a voice and they are simply just pods of victims of their circumstances. I want you to know that underneath those circumstances, the average teenager that's made it to high school and actually attending, you have no idea of the insurmountable odds that they champion every single day just leaving home and getting to school. Right? And so I believe that it is important to hear what they have to say, make them a part of that. Don't go in with just your ideology of what that is. Restorative practice, we're using it in Detroit. We're trying to turn Detroit into the first restorative justice and practice system. We've taught it to our police departments, taught it to our school educators. Again, that pushback, however, is what people believe works and what they don't. And sometimes, unfortunately, even if you show people the hard numbers, they still don't believe it.
Yes, well, no, that's, I really appreciate that, and things like victim offender mediation, that you have to explain to people this isn't, you know, something, it's actually a great way to hold people accountable for what they did, but in a way that restores. So I think we've really had a great discussion today, and I really appreciate this terrific panel, and we have a lot of great sessions to come. So thanks so much, bye-bye.